Okay, lecture 23. Today we're going to be talking about intercepts. Intercepts. A really good topic that does not get a lot of love, but I love it. So an intercept is kind of like in football when you have an interception. You know, you're trying to throw the ball down the field, trying to make as many yards up as you can. And for some reason, somebody in the other team catches the ball and then they run in the opposite direction, right? Well, the football player kind of intercepted the ball, and I want you to be thinking about interceptions today. And we do have a Cowboys fan in the crowd, and I'm a Ravens fan, so there you go. Didn't do too well last night, but that's fine. I'll be a Ravens fan until I die, I guess. But what I'm trying to say is, you know, when the opposing team catches the football, it's not a good situation for your side. And what's happening is the ball is going in a straight line, and then it's caught. And at that point, you call it the interception. Well, when we talk about intercepts in math, we're talking about where a line is going to cross the x-axis or the y-axis. And if it crosses the x-axis, that's called an x-intercept, right? Same way with the y-axis. If the line is going to cross the y-axis, we call that a what? A y-intercept. So that's important to know. So I'm going to start off with a few definitions. So, definition. We are going to be doing x-intercepts. X-intercepts. Okay, so what is an x-intercept? An x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. Where the graph crosses the x-axis. Okay. And where that happens, the y value is always 0. That's important to know. The y value is always 0. Very important key. So when we're talking about x-intercepts, we're talking about a graph of a function which passes through the x-axis, and that's called the x-intercept. So we can define x-intercept, and now what I want to do is I want to define the opposite, which is the y-intercept. So let's do that next. Definition, y-intercept. This is where the graph, can you tell I'm kind of repeating myself? Crosses not the x-axis, but the y-axis. The y-axis. And the x value. The x value is always 0. So here we pretty much have a mirror image. The y-intercept is where the graph is going to cross the y-axis. And here the x value is always going to be 0. And there is a reason for that. So let me draw a little diagram that will help you kind of get it all straight in your head. So let's say we have an x-axis and a y-axis. Now, when I draw a coordinate plane, or an XY plane as they call it, I draw a horizontal line that I call my x-axis. And I draw a vertical line that's called my y-axis. So basically what I've got here is I've got a horizontal line, and a vertical line. A vertical line. And when I draw my lines, I always put arrows at the ends, okay? So I'm going to label the horizontal axis the x-axis. And I'm going to label the vertical axis the y-axis, because the y-axis is always vertical. Now, let's say we put numbers on our number line. So I'm going to draw little tick marks on both axes for 1 and 2. So let's say this is 1 and this is 2. And then going in the opposite direction, we have the negative numbers. We have -1 and -2. Good. And then in the middle, of course, we have 0, right? But I'm not going to draw that. Now for the y-axis, if we go in the up direction, we have the positive numbers. So we're going to have 1 and 2. Pretty simple, right? Well, if we go the opposite direction, if we go down, we're going to get the negative numbers. So here I'm going to have -1 and -2. Okay? So this is the coordinate plane, also called the XY plane. And what we're going to do is we're going to put points on our graph. We're going to put a point right here at -1, and we're going to put a point right here at +1 on the x-axis and the y-axis respectively. Okay? So I'm going to pull out a ruler, which is always a good instrument to have, and I'm going to draw a straight line through those 2 points. So I put my ruler down. Hope I don't mess up. There we go. And I draw my line in between the 2 points. And then I put my arrows down. So arrow here, arrow here. Awesome. So I drew my line, and my question to you is, where does it cross the x-axis? Where does it cross the x-axis? That's going to be called my x-intercept. So the x-intercept is going to be what? Well, it crosses the x-axis at -1. So my x-intercept is going to be -1, 0. That's important to notice. The y value is always 0. And that comes straight from our definition up here. The y value is always 0. Now, that's the x-intercept. That's basically where the line is going to cross the x-axis. Now, let's do the opposite. Where does the line cross the y-axis? That's the next question I'm going to ask you. What is the y-intercept? Well, the graph is going to cross the y-axis where? At +1, okay? So it crosses the y-axis at +1 right here. So what that means is our y-intercept is going to be 0, 1. 0, +1. That's our y-intercept. And you're probably asking, why are we starting off with 0? It doesn't make any sense. Well, actually it does make sense, because notice the definition says the x value is always 0. That's why there's that 0 right there, okay? So if you're ever doing an x-intercept or a y-intercept, the opposite variable is going to be 0. So for the x-intercept, the y is going to be 0, and for the y-intercept, the x is going to be 0. Okay. So that is if you're looking at a graph. But what if I don't even give you a graph? Like, let's say I do an equation instead. How are we able to find the x-intercepts and y-intercepts for equations? Well, that's pretty simple. I'm going to pull out my red pen, and we're going to write a note. So, notes. To find x-intercepts. To find x-intercepts, let y equal 0. Let y equal 0. Okay? Now, if you want to find the y-intercepts, what do? I'm going to grab my blue pen. So here's the second note. To find y-intercepts, to find the y-intercepts, you want to let x equal 0. Okay? So where am I getting this information from? Am I just pulling it out of nowhere? Well, no. It comes from the definition, right? So for the x-intercepts, notice that I write the y value is always 0. The y value is always 0. So if I want to find an x-intercept, I have to let y be 0. Make sense? Okay. Now, if I want to find the y-intercepts, I got to let x be 0. And I'm getting that from this right here. The x value is always 0. Okay? So do you see where I'm getting this information from? You're always trying to take the opposite variable and set it equal to 0. So for the x-intercepts, let y be 0. If you want to find the y-intercepts, you let x be 0. So we're always using that opposite variable to help us. Okay? Now, let me zoom out and let's get to the first example. Good. Okay. So the first example is going to be 4x minus y equals 4. So here's the equation that they give us. And what I want to do is I want to find the x-intercepts and I want to find the y-intercepts. So for the x-intercepts, how do we find those? How do we find the x-intercepts? I just wrote it up here, right? We're going to let y be 0. So everywhere I see a y inside the equation, I'm going to let it be 0 and just see what happens, right? So let's let y be 0. I get 4x minus 0 equals 4. 4x minus 0 equals 4, right? So the only thing that I did was I kept everything the same. Almost everything is still the same. But I just let y be 0. Okay? Makes sense, right? So let's just go from there. Now, on the left side, I have 4x minus 0, right? Well, if I'm subtracting 0, does that necessarily change anything? Not really. I'm subtracting 0. I'm changing nothing about it. So really, the only thing that I should have on the left side is 4x. So I'm going to have 4x equals 4. 4x equals 4. And now what I can do is I can divide both sides by 4. Just probably what you were thinking of, right? So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And I get x equals 4 divided by 4, that's 1. Good. So now, what's my x-intercept going to be? It's going to be 1, right? But how do I write that as an ordered pair? How do I write it as an ordered pair? Well, I know my x-coordinate is going to be 1. I know that for a fact, right? So I put the 1 first. And then what's my y value going to be? Well, if you go back up to the definition, the y value is always what? 0, right? So I'm going to have a 0 here. That's my ordered pair. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the y-intercept. So let's do that on this side. How do we find the y-intercept? I just put it in a note up there, right? How do I find the y-intercept? I let x equal 0, okay? So that means everywhere I see an x, I'm going to put in 0 for x. Make sense? Okay, let's do it. So I'm going to have 4 times 0 minus y equals 4. Notice I haven't changed anything, but the only thing that I have changed is I've replaced x with a 0. That's it. Nothing else has changed. Okay? So let's figure out what's going on here. I have 4 times 0, right? 4 times 0. What would that be? That would just be 0, right? So I'm going to get 0 minus y equals 4. 0 minus y equals 4. And now I can start messing around with the left side because I know for a fact that the 0 isn't going to change anything. So I'm left with negative y equals 4. Negative y equals 4. Now, I want to get the y by itself, which means I want to get rid of that negative sign. Now, you can do this in 2 ways, right? You can multiply both sides by negative 1, or you can divide both sides by negative 1, which is what I'm going to do. So if I divide both sides by negative 1, what do I get? y equals what? Can you guess? -4. So that's my y-intercept. So now what's my ordered pair going to be? It's going to be 0, -4. I know that my y value is going to be -4. I got that from the problem. But how do I get my x value? I get it from this note right here. I'm letting x equal 0. Okay? So I'll give you guys a minute to copy that down. I know that was kind of a lot, but what we're going to do next is we're going to graph this line ourselves, and we're going to see that these two answers actually work themselves out. Okay? So I'll give you guys a minute to do that, and I will start writing down the next problem. Okay. So basically all we're doing is, if we want to find the x-intercept, we let y be 0, right? If we want to find the y-intercepts, we let x be 0. So we're always taking the opposite variable and letting it be 0 and just seeing what happens. Okay? There's not much more to it. The 0 is often not even going to affect anything, to be honest with you. But you do need that 0 in order to solve the problem. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you Desmos. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a new screen. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so this is Desmos. It's a graphing calculator that's basically a website. Okay, anybody can go to it. You don't need an account to get started. You just need to hit the blue button right there that says graphing calculator. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this. And what you're gonna see is your screen is divided into two parts. You got your input and you got your output. Whatever I graph over here on the left side is gonna show up on the right side of the screen. So let's type in the equation that we started off with, right? What was that? It was 4x minus y equals 4. Perfect. Okay, so I get a red line that pops up on my screen. So what are the x-intercepts? What are the x-intercepts? Well, where does it cross the x-axis? That's this horizontal line right here, right? It's going to cross right here, 1, 0. So does that match up with your answer? Yes, it does. So that's where the graph is going to cross the x-axis. But what about the y-intercept? That's where the graph is going to cross the y-axis, right? So let's look at where it crosses the y-axis. I think it crosses right here, 0, -4. So that's a good way to check your answers. You can actually graph the line on Desmos, okay? So if you didn't get all that, don't worry, because I'm going to be coming back to it as we keep on going, okay? Now, let me see if I can get back to my paper. Perfect. All right. So I'll leave that there for a few seconds. I'll let you guys get that, and then we'll move on to the next problem. Okay, so x-intercepts, we're going to let y be 0. But for the y-intercepts, we let x be 0. Make sense? Okay, let's apply it. So let's look at this one. I got y equals 2x plus 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on it so you can actually see it, right? Perfect. Okay, so I got y equals 2x plus 2. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the x-intercept, and that's going to involve letting y equal 0, okay? So let's just replace y with 0 and see what happens. I get 0 is equal to 2x plus 2. 2x plus 2. Right? So now what can I do to get x by itself? Well, I've got to get rid of that positive 2 first. How can I get rid of a positive 2? I can subtract 2 from both sides, right? So when I subtract 2 from both sides, what happens? Well, these 2's are going to cancel out. The 2x is going to come down. And on the left side, what's 0 minus 2? That's going to be negative 2. Good. So now, how can I get x by itself on the right side? How can I get x by itself? Well, I got to get rid of that 2 out in front. But how do I do that? Well, since it's multiplying, I need to divide both sides by 2. I need to divide both sides by 2. So you pretty much already knew that. And I get negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 comma 0. That's my x-intercept. Okay? So not too difficult. You're letting the opposite variable be 0 and just going from there, right? So now let's work on the y-intercept and see how we get that. This time we're going to let x be 0 and just see what happens. So I'm going to get y equals 2 times 0 plus 2. All I did was I replaced x with 0. That's it. Okay? So 2 times 0 is just 0. So I get y equals 0 plus 2. Got it? Okay. So now what's 0 plus 2 going to be? 0 plus 2 is going to be 2, obviously. So I get y equals 2. Positive 2, right? So this is going to be my y-intercept. So if my x is 0, my y is going to be 2. Okay? I'll give you guys a few seconds to copy that down, and then what we're going to do is we're going to check it by graphing it on Desmos, which is a whole lot better than using the TI-83 calculators that I have on the wall. I bet some of you don't even believe that, but it is true. Okay? Let's see if we can graph it. So I'm going to go to Desmos. Perfect. Okay. So to get rid of anything, you just hit the X. That's pretty much all you got to do. Now, what did we start off with? We started off with y equals 2x plus 2, right? So I'm going to have my y equals 2x plus 2. Yeah. Okay. So they give us a blue line this time. The color is just random. But check out where it crosses the x-axis. Where does it cross the x-axis? Right here. Negative 1 comma 0. Does that match up with what we got on our paper? Yes. Perfect. Okay. So where does it cross the y-axis then? It crosses at this point right here. 0 comma 2. And that's exactly what we got when we did it the algebra way. Okay? So let me go back to the paper. There we go. I'm getting better at this. All right? So I'm going to zoom out so you guys can keep on seeing that. And I'm going to move on to our last example. Okay. 2x minus 7y equals 14. Okay? Go ahead and see if you can find the x-intercept and the y-intercept. See if you can get it before I get it, because you pretty much know how to do it at this point, I hope. So the x-intercept, you got to let y be 0, right? So the x-intercept, you got to let y be 0. And then just see what happens. But for the y-intercept, you let x be 0. Okay, so if I let y be 0, what happens? I get 2x minus 7 times 0 equals 14, right? So the only thing that changed is I put in 0 for y, but everything else stays the same. And then I go from there, right? So what's -7 times 0? That would be 0, right? So essentially, I get 2x minus 0 equals 14. So far, so good, right? Okay. So the -0 doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because it's not really going to change anything. You know, whether you add 0 or subtract 0, it doesn't change anything. It's kind of like multiplying by 1, right? If you multiply something by 1, does it change? No, right? So this isn't really going to change anything. So I can just write 2x equals 14. Okay, so how do I get x by itself? I divide both sides by what? 2, right? So if I divide both sides by 2, what do I get? I get x equals 7. So my point is going to be 7, 0. Awesome. Is that what you got? I hope so. Okay. So let's do the y-intercept now. This time, I'm just going to let x be 0 and see what happens. So what do I get? I get 2 times 0 minus 7y equals 14. Okay. So 2 times 0, that's going to give me 0, right? So 0 minus 7y equals 14. Now, since the 0 doesn't do anything, I can just bring down the -7y. Pretty much the same thing. And then how do I get the y by itself? I divide both sides by -7. -7. And I get y equals -2. Or 0, -2. Okay? I'll let that sit there for a minute, and then we'll check our answers by graphing, and then I'll do my 5-minute spiel at the end. Okay? So it's not too complicated. All you're doing is you're letting x be 0, letting y be 0, and you're showing all your work, right? Or else you won't get credit. Duh. Okay? So let's look at the graph. Okay. I hit my x to get rid of it, and I'm going to type in 2x minus 7y equals 14. Yeah, 14. Good. Okay. So where is my x-intercept? It is over here. That's where the line crosses the x-axis. 7, 0. Makes sense? Okay. So where does it cross the y-axis? It crosses right here. 0, -2. So I hope that helps. All right, let me go back to my screen. Perfect. All right. So what